Hello and welcome to another of PAVE's weekly virtual panel discussions. My name is Ed Niedermeyer. I am the Communications Director here at Partners for Automated Vehicle Education. We're very glad you've joined us today. We have one of the most fascinating topics today to discuss, I think, in this whole realm, which is, what does it mean to really go to driverless operations? For those of you who don't know, a lot of AV development work is done with safety operators behind the wheel, and the process of removing those safety operators, that sort of human safety net, is obviously a really, really important one. Says a lot of things about where the technology is, but it also brings a whole lot of really fascinating issues, many of which you kind of have to learn by doing. And so I'm really thrilled that we have two people here who have been doing just that, learning by actually doing. So this is not just a question of theory here. This is a question of folks who have some real experience with driverless operations, and that's because Waymo has been operating driverlessly in the Phoenix, Arizona area for quite some time now. And so we're thrilled to have two people who have been involved with those driverless operations. First of all, from the user experience or UX researcher team, Kerry Brennan. Kerry, welcome. And we also have a product manager from Trip Infrastructure and Local Delivery, Cameron Blume. Cameron, welcome.
Hi, thanks.
So I want to start with something that a question, and by the way, these questions have all been submitted to us from you, the audience. One of the questions that really leapt out at me, because I was lucky enough to in late 2019 to actually get a driverless ride from Waymo in the Chandler area. I was actually able to talk to some of the folks on the UX research team, and it was just so fascinating to understand some of the challenges that they're tackling here. And so we're going to start with that. And there's a question, what are AV companies focused on about the user experience these days? So Kerry, this one's obviously going to go to you, but sort of what does going driverless mean for the user experience, and what are you all working on in that regard?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me here today. I bungled the mute button there, so hopefully that won't happen again. As you had mentioned, I'm a user experience researcher at Waymo, so I love talking about this kind of question. I know the question asked about AV companies generally, but of course, I'll just be speaking from my Waymo point of view, not to speak for others. But I think that what's so exciting and what we're so focused on is that this is truly a brand new user interaction. It is riding in a car with no one up front. So as you mentioned, we opened this up to our Waymo One passengers in Phoenix, and we have hundreds of riders every week that are getting to experience this. But we really have to think about in designing that UX, what riders are accustomed to. And in some cases, that's other ride hailing or just other transportation choices in general. But how does a fully autonomous vehicle with no one up front change those expectations? And how can we really reassure people, make them feel comfortable, and make something feel natural that is actually totally unnatural? It is very unnatural to be in a car with no one in the driver's seat, but it's our task as a user experience team to make it feel really smooth, really safe, and just a delightful experience. And just to kind of offer one example of a recent feature that I was part of the team working on, we recently released a stop that lets riders make more than one stop on their Waymo ride. So while they're booking, they can either plan a trip with multiple stops, or they can add stops on the go. And that's something that we had heard from our riders, that's how they use their own cars. And that's kind of like they run errands, they drop their kids off at school, or maybe they just want to book a round trip all in one go. So we were able to develop this feature to meet that need for our riders. But when you think about making multiple stops, you might assume there's a driver there, and you can just ask the driver, can we pull over for a minute? I need to pick up something at the store. And maybe you feel a little bit bad about putting them out or about asking them to do that. Maybe you wouldn't be sure if they'd come back for you after you got out of the car. But we had to design this whole interaction with no driver with no human driver in the picture, just the Waymo driver. And so really thinking through that, making that a great experience, understanding and doing research on riders' expectations so that we could meet their needs, and really remembering that our whole goal is let's make this interaction feel easy and not feel stressful, even when we're really changing that interaction paradigm of talking to a human driver.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's easy for people who aren't familiar with this kind of work to underestimate just how much work it takes to create a natural interaction like that, right? Because humans have this, even if you're a bad driver, right? You have a kind of certain level of empathy and sympathy with someone that allows you to be, and flexibility, right? To take those kinds of unexpected questions or requests, right? Yeah. So Cameron, sort of on a similar note, we have a question here. Autonomous vehicles drive differently than typical human drivers in some situations. How do you manage the anxiety that passengers could feel when that happens, or does it not happen at all?
Sure. So at least from the product perspective, we've thought of a couple ideas, and I can give some examples for how we've tried to deal with that. One thing we've experimented with is we have tried announcing when the car does a lane change. So rather than the wheel just going, we say lane change, and then the wheel goes. And that way, you know that the wheel is about to turn, so that doesn't catch you by surprise. Something else is that if the vehicle makes the decision to hit the brakes, and in a strong braking, we also have an experience around that where we'll make a tone, and on the monitors during the car, we'll use color, and then we'll also try to identify why the car is doing that on the monitor, so we can show that in the visualization there, so that something like that doesn't come completely out of the blue. Another thing that I will point out, in this is something that I've experienced in autonomous vehicles, is I actually think that they brake better than I can. So if you think of when you're coming up to a stop sign and you just try to hit the brake pedal as smoothly as you possibly can, so you come to a gentle stop, and there's no like rock back or anything like that. It's actually kind of hard to do that really, really well and then have it be perfect. But at least in the Waymo vehicles, they do it much better than I can ever do. So it actually feels smoother, at least in that specific interaction, than you normally would have with a human in the front. As for anxiety, does it happen? I know my personal experience when I got into a Waymo for the first time, I was very excited. I was like, this is an autonomous car. This is going to be crazy. And I got in, and then within a few minutes, you're just like, well, this is just a conservative, very safe driver. And I think you see with a lot of people when they get in the car for the first time, they go in with a lot of energy and excitement, and within a couple of minutes, they're just kind of bored. And that's, yeah, that's a lot of what we see.
Yeah. It's fascinating to have boredom almost be a goal for the user experience, and certainly with the point you make about braking. I remember when I was learning how to drive, and my dad had to be like, think of yourself as a limo driver, right? You're not just driving to get yourself around. Imagine that you're driving someone else, and it really is a very different way of driving than just getting from point A to point B as fast as you can, right? Kerry, how much and how and why does age of the consumer impact their experience and expectations of the experience of driverless vehicles? It's something we hear about a lot. I'd love to get your perspective on that.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's obviously top of mind for a lot of folks. And I feel like first, maybe not embedded in this question, but when people talk about age and aging and autonomous vehicles, there's often an assumption that, as people age, or older adults don't like technology, or they're scared of technology. And, I think in my experience and what we've seen from our riders is that views on technology aren't only driven by age. And I just want to make sure that we acknowledge that even as I go ahead and answer this question. But just for an anecdote, my parents are in their 70s. They came to visit me here in Phoenix, and we all took a ride in the Waymo. And I watched them embrace it and play around with the tech. They're tapping on the in-car screen. They're having a little disagreement about which view of the screen. Is it like the first person view is better, or the bird's eye view is better? And then I have friends my own age, and they don't like downloading new apps at all. And I just kind of think it's important for us to really keep that, top of mind. But the other thing that I'll say as a UX researcher is that it's actually really important to me that we on the UX team make our app and our entire service as intuitive and delightful as possible, regardless of where a consumer falls on the age spectrum. So I would almost say it's like my job to make sure age doesn't negatively impact or doesn't, affect your experience, if that makes sense. And, for example, we also in our UX research, we make sure to recruit a broad representation across the age spectrum. We're working on partnerships with organizations that work with older adults to make sure that, if there are unique needs and unique use cases, that we can understand those and design for those. I think that the thing that I always come back to, and we really embrace principles of universal design on the UX team, is that sure, as you age, maybe you are tired of driving, maybe you no longer can drive for whatever reason. And we think that we as Waymo have a really great opportunity there to make sure that you retain your mobility independence. As I like to say, we're designing and we're building autonomous driving to support autonomous people, because we really want folks, no matter their age, to have that independence of getting around.
Absolutely. Yeah. People talk about this sometimes as mobility, but that personal autonomy means not just getting where you need to go, but doing it, when you want to, how you want to. And
on demand, not having to rely on anybody, not having to ask your neighbor or your family member for a ride, unless you want to, unless you enjoy spending time with them. Maybe you take the Waymo together.
Absolutely. Cameron, how's the landscape for AV technology and logistics and delivery? For AV technology in logistics and delivery changing since sort of the COVID-19 pandemic?
Okay, great. Yeah, this one's really close to for me because one of my primary product areas is local delivery. So yeah, COVID definitely has completely changed the delivery landscape for all types of delivery, not just autonomous. I know many businesses have been innovating and trying all sorts of different things around delivery. I think people are considering having things delivered that they never would have considered having delivered before delivery. So a lot of that I think was spurred by the pandemic, but I also believe that having tried those services, a lot of them are just really good services, even without the pandemic. So personally, I think a lot of that is going to be sticky. And even once the pandemic recedes and things are more back to normal, we'll probably see a lot of these products still around. I know personally, grocery delivery and grocery pickup have both been great. That's not something we ever did before the pandemic. And now I don't know if I'll ever go back. It's just so convenient and great. So then how does this apply to autonomy? So when we think about doing delivery with autonomy, one of the major differences is that there is not a person in the car to bring the item to your doorstep. So the car can drive to right in front of your house, but that not even the last mile, the last meter is actually going to be pretty different from a customer perspective. So that also, I think, will vary a lot based on what you're delivering. So if you have a hot meal, normally if you order that through a human-driven delivery service, you're not going to let that sit on your doorstep very long. You're going to go get it right away. If you order a bottle of shampoo, you might let that sit until, I've definitely left packages on my porch for a while if it wasn't super urgent. If you were to deliver those things autonomously, now you need to have a pretty quick interaction where the car arrives and the person goes out to the car and unloads whatever they're unloading. So I think our goal at the moment is to try to test as many types of deliveries as we possibly can so we can learn about those customer interactions and talk to people and see how people like it, because that's going to inform our strategy and our longer term roadmap for how autonomy fits into delivery. I know, for example, we have some existing partnerships. We've been delivering packages for UPS, and these are in bulk, like dozens of packages in modified minivans. We've also tried delivering auto parts from the stock warehouse that's part of a dealership to various businesses around Chandler that are doing auto repairs, so that we can do auto parts delivery. But I'd love to try pretty much anything else I can think of. So hot meals, groceries, my goal is to try to deliver as many things as I possibly can and try to learn as much as I possibly can from our customers about how well that works.
Yeah, and Kerry, as you're sort of doing this learning, sort of what are some of the biggest challenges you face in doing sort of that UX research piece? The question includes, do you use a simulator? How are you assessing the issue of vigilance? How do you approach the problem of measuring trust?
Yeah, this is a great question. I think, of course, the there's a few questions here, so I might not get to all of them, but the thing that's really top of mind that I want to make sure to acknowledge is that, of course, the biggest challenge right now is that we as researchers cannot get in the car with our riders. That's something that, we all are really missing. I know we're all missing a lot of stuff because of the pandemic, but just from this UX research perspective, we used to ride with our riders all the time. We would grab our GoPros, we'd grab our notebooks, and we would just embed ourselves in that point of view. So, we've had to get creative, and we've made adjustments, whether it's having them film themselves or, talking to them afterwards and before, et cetera. But I definitely miss that like really hands-on kind of firsthand element of doing that in-ride research. As far as the question on simulation, simulation is a huge and important part of Waymo's work generally. We've driven over 20 billion miles in simulation. I know we'd like to mention that number a lot. But as far as the UX research component, we have, discussed and explored simulation, virtual reality as opportunities for us potentially to explore. But to be perfectly honest, we're so fortunate to have real live riders in real live autonomous vehicles that we learn so much from doing research with those folks that the maybe urgency for VR or simulation hasn't come through quite as much in our research. And as a qualitative UX researcher, I really enjoy the kind of, you don't know what to expect about real world situations, and we can explore that nuance, that complexity, versus simulation and VR, of course, are really great when you really want to be able to control all your variables and have maybe a more controlled experiment to get feedback or to understand the UX. But for now, we're just crossing our fingers that we can get back to in-person research soon. And as far as measuring trust, which was the other part of the question, if I remember correctly, it's definitely something that we do measure. We track that. We are constantly working to build that because we see it as so core to our work. We take safety so seriously, and we see that trust really coming from our value of safety. I'll say we know from surveys that social acceptance of autonomous driving has been increasing over the years. And I think Cameron alluded to this in his own personal experience of riding with the Waymo, that we actually see this on a really micro scale, this trust building, where we have riders who take their first ride every day, and they go from maybe being a little bit skeptical, maybe being nervously excited, to just super trusting and looking at their phone instead of keeping their eyes on the wheel. So that's a kind of another element of trust that we get to see regularly as well.
Absolutely, and that's certainly, when we did a poll last year on this issue, we saw that personal experience was what people said just had the most fundamental impact. And actually, I just really quick to clarify, are there major differences between sort of the first driverless ride versus an autonomous ride with a safety driver? Do you see major differences in sort of the reaction? I know we didn't prepare for this question, but I'm just I'm dying.
I've actually, some of our research findings we haven't necessarily talked about publicly yet. But what I will say is that we have done research on that. So we have looked at folks who were part of our riding program when we still had, attended vehicles. And we've looked at folks who have taken their first ride since we went to fully autonomous driving experience. And because it is something that, we're really interested in and interested in designing for that as we go into the future.
Absolutely. And I asked simply just because the difference for me between a driverless ride and rides with a safety driver, it was really a profound moment for me. And it really made me, think about a lot of the issues that I'm sure you deal with all the time. So it's just, yeah, I think it's easy to underestimate sort of how different it can be to ride an autonomous vehicle with a safety driver versus with a human that doesn't want to die, right? Versus all by yourself, just you and the machine. But it also has a more profound impact on your trust, I think, probably. It certainly did for me. Getting back into the sort of development issues, Cameron, what are some of the key differences between on-road, so public roadways, and off-road closed course testing of automated vehicles? Can you describe the feedback loop between these different kinds of testing?
Yeah, there's definitely a feedback loop. So On-road mileage there's really no substitute for that. It's something that's necessary because that's the environment that we plan to actually deploy the vehicles in. But there's a big benefit to doing closed course testing to supplement that. So some of the benefits are there are situations that are actually very rare in on-road environments. Sometimes these are, pretty dangerous situations, and to encounter them just naturally out on the road requires a lot of time, and even then, like, you might not encounter them that much. So one of the benefits of doing closed course testing is you can actually set up these structured scenarios with physical cars and people and testers to test these sorts of situations without having to go find them out in the real world. And so there's a benefit there that you can test them many more times than you could find in the real world. And also you can test them in a much safer manner than you could in the real world, because there are different, safety measures you can put in place, both within the way that the autonomous vehicle is set up, and also the fact that the people who are in the other vehicles in the interaction are testers who are aware that there's a test going on. So if you were dealing with something that involves like higher speeds or swerves or something like that, it's just a much safer way to get that test going in the vehicle rather than encountering it on the road.
Yeah, and it's fascinating how both in the UX and in the vehicle, the driving development part of it, you have some of that testing is to just figure out things that you explore things you don't know and find out where the problems are. But then once you do sort of have that piece to sort of drill down into that problem and really solve it. And it's interesting to see the parallels there between the driving development and that UX piece. Kerry, one of these questions is a topic that's very dear to my heart. Is there a consideration and plan to ensure that all driverless vehicles are accessible to those who are in wheelchairs and others who have mobility issues, can easily enter and exit the vehicles? From a digital equity standpoint, is the technology that is powering AVs easy for those who are not comfortable with technology? Are you using a set of universal tech standards that will make it easy for anyone, regardless of their level of comfort with the technology, to use an AV service for their transportation needs? It's a long kind of a series of questions. We kind of addressed some of those with the earlier question about the age, but on accessibility in particular, I'd love to hear what you have to say there.
Yeah, for sure. It's a great question. And yeah, I think I'm going to just focus on the first part of the question, because we did kind of cover that we do really try and design our tech in such a way that regardless of your comfort, you'll find it very enjoyable and delightful to use. But I think it's great. I'm really happy that we're going to talk about accessibility, because it's a really important topic. It's something that we think a lot about. And we also know this question in particular, it mentions wheelchairs and other wheelchair users, and others who have mobility issues. And I think it's also important to just acknowledge how diverse the disability community is. And so when we talk about accessibility, I think we really are committed to that whole range of potential consumer needs. And we know that there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all approach that's going to work. Especially since we've seen that traditional transportation options, are not fully meeting the needs of members of these communities. And we think that autonomous driving has a lot of potential for that mobility independence and to support these communities. So we're continuing to listen, continuing to work on this. I think we've made some really significant commitments to making sure that our experience is accessible. And speaking specifically to folks with mobility disabilities or folks who use wheelchairs, currently Waymo cars can accommodate a wheelchair or mobility device as long as it can fold up and fit in like the passenger area of the car. So currently our vehicles can't carry a non-folding wheelchair. So riders who do use wheelchairs and who need a wheelchair accessible vehicle, they can use our app. They can actually contact our rider support team through the app, and our rider support team will call and arrange a wheelchair accessible vehicle service for them to make sure that they get where they need to go. That's where we are right now. That's not where we're going to end up, and that's not an ending or a stopping point for us. We're continuing to have conversations about wheelchair accessible vehicles, and at the same time trying to find a solution to that. But rather at the same time, we've also in parallel been developing and have had for a while features that support folks with a range of other accessibility needs as well. So that could include folks who may have trouble finding where the car is located, they can hit a button in the app that honks the horn and helps them locate it. We have a setting in the app where you can tell Waymo, please don't try and pick me up across the street from where I've asked you to come to. Even if it will save me time, I really need you to come as close to me as possible. We have other features like while you're riding, you can have extra audio support. So it's like descriptive, assistive audio about your ride. That might be useful for some of our folks who are blind or visually impaired or who just want more reassurance of what's going on with their ride. And similarly, we have different communication options. So I know I've mentioned rider support a couple times. You can contact rider support via a voice call, but we also know that voice calls don't work for everybody, whether that's because you're deaf or hard of hearing or just for any other reason. You can also contact rider support via chat in the app. So those are just, a couple of things. I should also just say, I hope it kind of goes without saying, but our app is of course compatible with screen readers. It works in high contrast mode. So those are some of those just expected things that we do, even as we work towards, more and more features in the future.
Yeah. And again, I think it's fascinating that, everyone kind of, or a lot of people understand, how diverse and kind of random in some ways the road driving on a public road can be. But I think it's easy to forget how diverse people are and customers and everything they need. So this is it's such a fascinating and complex and challenging, problem to solve this UX piece. I think a lot of people underappreciate that.
Yeah. And I think one thing that we just talk a lot about on our team is that, designing for quote unquote accessibility improves the experience for all of our riders. So that's kind of why I took care even to describe some of our features, not linking them to any particular disability, because sure, maybe that's a case that it's going to be extra helpful, but that's not the only case in which it's going to be helpful. And I think that's really important also to talk about when we talk about the user experience, and anything that might kind of come in under the umbrella of accessibility is actually going to be great for all of our riders, because human needs are so diverse and human experiences are so diverse.
Yeah, like just to jump in there, one thing that I worked on was that feature to minimize walking times that you can flip on. And I mean, that's useful if you just have an armful of groceries. Like that, it's not only an accessibility feature, that's something that helps everyone.
Yeah, and Cameron, sort of one more sort of driverless experience. I think this question is great because it really illustrates sort of the range of things that just might not occur to someone that come up with a driverless ride. But what safety systems are in place to deal with things that are accidentally or intentionally, which is even more fascinating, right? Left behind in the vehicle when passengers get out of a vehicle with no driver, right? There's no one there to say, hey, you left your thing. How do you deal with that? How do you begin to deal with that?
Yeah, so currently the procedure we do is that once the trip is over, and the doors open and people are out of the car, we actually just shoot the video feed quickly over to one of our customer support agents, and they do a quick visual check of the car just to see if there's any left items in there. And then just depending on the situation, we have a couple different plans in place, whether that's calling the rider, letting them know if the car is right there, or if they're gone, we also have procedures in place for getting the car back to the depot, recovering the item, and then arranging for a way to get it back to them.
Yeah. And just sort of wrapping up here, Kerry, what would you recommend we tell our fellow drivers that would make them feel more comfortable and confident in the technology that comes with vehicles today and into the future?
Ooh, that's a good one. Well, I guess I should just preface by saying that Waymo's technology is not currently available in any car that you can just go and buy yourself, but you can always come and ride Waymo One to experience it. But I think if someone was asking me about this, the things that I would really go back to are safety. And I think Waymo, in our 11 years, we have just gone all in on safety. And the numbers are hard to wrap your head around. I already mentioned the 20 billion miles driven in simulation. I mean, 20 billion is a lot of miles in simulation. It makes our number of road miles in real life, which is 20 million, which is also a totally huge number. And so just really the care that we take, and at every point, every decision before something hits the road, there's so many decision makers and gates and considerations to make sure that is ready to go before it's out in the world. And then I think that the other thing that I would just it's not a happy thing to bring up, but that it's really important to the conversation that too many people are hurt or killed by human drivers every single year. That number globally is gigantic, 1.35 million. But even in the United States, hundreds of people every day. And so I know I'm throwing around a lot of numbers, but for folks who that helps make decisions or helps reassure, I do think that those are the things that I would really stick to, is the safety of the Waymo driver, especially as compared to those numbers that we see for human drivers.
Yeah, and we are just about out of time, but Cameron, I have one more question I just have to ask you, because the question is, are there sensor limitations which are preventing more rapid progress? I think this reflects sort of, just one of those things that people, are kind of unsure about with this technology. I mean, to me, I think some of the things you've described today have already sort of shown like this is a much more complicated problem than I think most people think through. But I'm just, what are your sort of final thoughts on that question?
Sure, yeah. So the answer is no, and we don't know. So I'll elaborate on that. So at the moment, we have the Pacifica minivans operating our fully autonomous rider-only fleet in Phoenix, and those are using the 4th generation sensors. And those are operating just fine in fully autonomous mode safely with that generation of sensors. But that said, building a new generation of sensors is a multi-year project. So we had already started building our 5th generation of sensors well before we had gone into fully autonomous mode on the 4th generation of sensors. So the new Jaguar I-Pace platform uses our 5th generation of sensors. They're a very large improvement. We're really excited about them. So I guess we'll never really know if we hadn't built our 5th generation of sensors, what would have happened if we just stuck with the 4th one and then put the car into like as hard of a challenging environment as we possibly could have. I guess we'll never really know now, but the good news is that we have the 5th generation of sensors, so I don't think we anticipate any sort of limitations.
Absolutely. Well, this has been just really fascinating. I could probably go on and on, but we are definitely through with our time. I want to thank you both so much for taking the time to come and share all the things that you've learned today. Cameron Blume, product manager at Waymo, thanks so much for being here.
Yep, thank you very much.
And Kerry Brennan, UX researcher at Waymo, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks so much for the invitation.
And I want to thank our audience, as always, for making the time to prioritize AV education. We know there's lots of demands on your time. We really appreciate the time that you do spend with us. And we do hope that you will join us again next week. In the meantime, you can find us on social media at PAVE Campaign. The video for this session will be on YouTube, so you can share it with others who weren't able to make it live today. And we do hope that you'll be back here again next week, because we have another really interesting topic planned for you then. And we hope to see you then.